Welcome back to GCC Kids Connection, where we are connecting with each other while you're home from school. We're connecting with some really cool books, and most importantly, we're connecting with God's Word. We're so glad you're here.
Well, hi kids, welcome back. I have some things with me today, and they're kind of unusual things that go together. I have here a jar of raw honey. Doesn't it look wonderful? Looks really good. And I have here a nice old book. And as we begin our story today, we have a grandpa who's taking honey and pouring honey on top of a book. I wonder why he does that. Well, let's find out. It's in a book called Thank You, Mr. Fokker, and it's written by Patricia Polacca. If you remember way back when we first started our story time, we read a book called Thunder Cake. Thunder Cake was also written by this author, Patricia Polacca. Now, the really cool thing about this book, and we'll find out at the end, this book is autobiographical. That means it's a story that the author wrote about herself. And it's a really neat story. It's called Thank You, Mr. Fokker. And it begins with an introduction that says, the grandpa held the jar of honey so that the whole family could see it. And then he dripped a ladle into the drizzling honey, and he drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, and your older brother, and now you. Then he handed the book to her. Taste. She dipped her finger in the honey and put it in her mouth. What does it taste like? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, sweet. Then all of the family said in a single voice, yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was hers at last. Soon she was going to learn how to read. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather and grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day, she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class had begun to read. Not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her to watch her do magic with her crayons. In first grade, you'll learn to read, her brother said. In first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, the first reader, sounding out letters and words. They said, boy, and look. The teachers smiled at them when they put the sounds together to make the right word. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggly shapes, and when she tried to sound out words, the other kids just laughed at her. Tricia, what are you looking at in that book, they'd say. I'm reading, she would say back at them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And when the other kids moved up to the second reader and the third reader, she stayed by herself in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel kind of dumb. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in a small woods behind their farm. It was twilight, and the air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were going around in the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Why, of course, her grandmother answered. To be different is the miracle of life. You see all these little fireflies? Every one of them is different. Do you think I'm smart? Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandmother hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little girl I know. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandmother's arms, and reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming through from the other side, and she used to say that someday when she got on the other side where the light was, she would look down on her. One evening they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will be there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll get lifted up off the ground and you'll be out of here. They laughed and both hugged and hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandmother must have let go of the grass because she went to heaven where the lights are. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Tricia would watch at the top of their heads to see if there was something happening in their heads that was not happening in hers. The numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She was never able to add right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, the numbers looked like they were a stack of blocks, all wobbly and ready to fall down. She just knew she must be dumb. Then one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and the kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 whole days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. Cat, ran. She was reading like a baby, and she was in 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer almost every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called to her on the playground. How come you're so dumb? Other kids standing near him started to laugh. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandma's farm in Michigan. Now Tricia wanted to go to school even less and less. I have a sore throat, she would say to her mom, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then, when Tricia started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and his slick gray pants that he wore. He had the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers' pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Dave and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Fokker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Fokker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whisper, "That is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn from their seats to look at her drawings. But they still laughed whenever she gave the wrong answer. Then one day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy, and then the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Fokker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anybody laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her in the playground and leaned in her face and said, "Toad." Tricia was afraid to turn any corner for fear Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who tried to tease her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or in the bathroom and jump out and scare her and yell, "Stupid" or "Ugly." And Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during free time and not have to go outside to play. It was dark and the place was completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" He laughed at her, and he pulled her out into the hallway and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric right down to the office, and when he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you'll have to worry about him again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say exactly the same thing, and he would say, "Good." Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help with the blackboards. He put on music and brought out a little sandwich, and they talked as they worked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters, and you write them on the board with the wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted, and she wiped a watery A. "8," he shouted, and she made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers, and then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked the way they were supposed to. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her by the arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor thing," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful you must feel and how lonely and afraid." Tricia just sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters and numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time, and you've fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, my girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Pleasy, the reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in sand and then big sponge circles on the blackboard going from left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters up on the screen and Tricia shouted them out really loud. Other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And it felt good. But though she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence yet. And deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they started? Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She opened a book she had never seen before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed to it. Almost as if it were magic, or as if the light poured into her brain, the words and the sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off to... Slowly she read a sentence, then another and another, and finally she read the whole paragraph and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Pleasy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open the front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed the jar of honey. Then she went to the living room and found the book on the shelf, the very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey onto the cover and tasted the sweetness. The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book. Then she held the book, the honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears rolling down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were happy, so very happy. There's an epilogue to this book, too. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know, because I was that little girl, Patricia Palaka. I saw Mr. Falker again about 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and I introduced myself. At first, he had difficulty placing me, and then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life. He hugged me and asked me what I did for a living. I said, "Why, Mr. Falker, I make books for children." Thank you, Mr. Falker. That book always makes me cry. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the story called Thank You, Mr. Falker. And I'm guessing that you probably have a really cool teacher like Mr. Falker. Well, our activity sheet for Thank You, Mr. Falker has a couple of thinking questions on it. And then down at the bottom is a suggestion. And it says, why not take some time to write a thank you note to one of your teachers? Even though the year it was cut short, tell them about the things you especially liked while you were in school, or maybe you just want to say thank you to them for providing all of the online classes that they're providing for you now. So take some time to think about the story, and then I just know that your teacher would love to hear from you. So why don't you take some time to write a thank you note to one of your special teachers? Thanks a lot, and I'll see you the next time.